what happens when people are told they have self-government, but the most important decisions about their future are still made by someone else? In 2016, Puerto Rico got two major answers. Within weeks of each other, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle, and Congress passed the Fiscal Oversight and Debt Restructuring Law, PROMESA. Different events, different institutions, but both reveal the same truth. Puerto Rico is still governed under a territorial status that denies full equality and full democratic power to the U.S. citizens on the island. To understand why these anniversaries matter, we have to understand what each one showed. On June 9, 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a major ruling in a case called Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle. The case focused on the double jeopardy clause, but the court's decision went far beyond criminal law. It addressed a much bigger constitutional question: who ultimately holds power over Puerto Rico? The Supreme Court said that despite having its own constitution and elected government, Puerto Rico is not a separate sovereign like U.S. states are. States have their own inherent sovereignty under the Constitution. Puerto Rico, the court said, does not. Instead, Puerto Rico's governing authority ultimately comes from Congress under the territorial clause of the U.S. Constitution. In other words, Puerto Rico's local government exercises power that Congress allows it to exercise, not powers that originate directly from the people of Puerto Rico in the same constitutional way a state's powers do. The ruling directly challenged the long-promoted idea that Puerto Rico had evolved into a fully autonomous political entity, a so-called commonwealth, with sovereignty separate from the federal government. The court made clear that under the Constitution, Puerto Rico remains a territory, and that its local government continues to be subordinated to the broad constitutional authority of Congress and the federal government. And then came PROMESA, not as a legal theory, but as a real-world demonstration of the plenary powers of Congress over the island. Just weeks later, on June 30th, 2016, Congress passed PROMESA in response to Puerto Rico's fiscal and debt crisis. The law created a federal financial oversight and management board with sweeping power over the island's finances, including the authority to override locally approved laws. Even though the board is not elected by and is not accountable to Puerto Rico's voters. So in the very same month that the Supreme Court clarified that Puerto Rico's governing authority ultimately remains subordinate to Congress under its territorial status, Congress demonstrated just how far that authority could be overridden in practice. Despite having its own constitution, governor, and legislature, Puerto Rico could still be placed under the control of an unelected 7-member board with extraordinary power over the island's affairs. That's why these two anniversaries are so significant. One was a Supreme Court ruling affirming that Puerto Rico is not a separate sovereign under the Constitution, and that its governing authority ultimately derives from Congress. The other was a federal law imposed by a government in which Puerto Rico has no voting representation in Congress or in presidential elections, demonstrating that Congress can exercise sweeping authority over the island without Puerto Ricans having equal voting power over the federal officials making those decisions. And together, they tell us a story that's bigger than a legal or financial story. They expose the core reality of Puerto Rico's territorial status. More than 3.2 million U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico live under federal law, serve in the U.S. military, and contribute to the nation. Yet they still have no voting representation in Congress, cannot vote for president in general elections, and can be treated unequally under federal laws and programs. That's not equal representation, and that's exactly why the statehood movement matters. Because PROMESA and Puerto Rico versus Sanchez Valle did not create Puerto Rico's democratic deficit problem, they revealed it. They showed that territory status is not a path to permanent equality. It's a system in which federal power can still be exercised over Puerto Rico without full representation, without full voting rights, or equal political power for the American citizens who live there. So as we reflect on these anniversaries, the lesson is clear. Puerto Rico does not need more reminders of the limits of territorial status. It needs a permanent solution. And for the statehood movement, that means continuing to fight for equal citizenship, equal representation, and equal rights under the American flag. So join us. Go to pr51st.com, click Take Action, and be part of the movement.